My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 33 years old. 2 weeks ago, I stood in a chandelier-lit ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan, surrounded by nearly 200 of my father's colleagues, investors, and longtime family friends, and listened as my mother leaned casually into a microphone and said, "At least Claire managed to find a husband, even if none of us are quite sure what he actually does." The room laughed. Some people tried to hide it behind polite smiles. Others didn't bother. A few even turned their heads to look directly at our table in the back corner of the room, curiosity written plainly across their faces. My father chuckled softly on stage. My younger brother smirked into his champagne glass. And my husband, the man my family had quietly dismissed for the past 4 years, slowly pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. What happened next made one of my father's senior investors drop his wine glass. It made my mother's smile freeze on her face. And it made my brother finally understand why, in 4 years of marriage, I had never once asked my parents for a single dollar. But before I tell you what happened that night, take a second to subscribe to Women Reddit Stories if you enjoy stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Because this story didn't begin in that ballroom. It started 7 years earlier. The night I met Daniel. I was 26 at the time, fresh out of graduate school and completely exhausted. I had just finished a 14-hour shift at the pediatric wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. My feet ached, my hair was tied in the kind of messy bun that only happens after a very long day, and the only thing I wanted in the world was a large coffee and 15 minutes of silence. The cafe across the street from the hospital was packed that night. Every table was taken except for one empty chair across from a man sitting quietly with a laptop open in front of him. I hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Is this seat taken?" I asked. He looked up. Dark hair. Kind eyes. The kind of calm expression you don't see very often in downtown Chicago. "Not at all," he said, closing his laptop halfway. "Please." I sat down with my coffee and sighed. For the first 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. He worked on something on his computer. I scrolled through patient notes on my tablet and tried not to fall asleep sitting upright. Eventually he glanced up and smiled. "Long day?" he asked. "You have no idea." "What do you do?" "I'm a pediatric nurse," I said. "Or at least that's what I'm trying to be." Tonight felt more like surviving a small war. He laughed softly. "Well, I work in education," he said. I nodded politely. We didn't talk much after that. But when I stood up to leave, he looked up again. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. I surprised myself by smiling. "Maybe." I came back the next night. And so did he. For the next 2 months, we shared that same little corner table almost every evening after my shift. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we worked quietly beside each other. Sometimes we argued about terrible hospital coffee. I learned that Daniel worked in education technology. He learned that I loved working with kids more than anything in the world. He never once asked about my family. And I never volunteered the information. For the first time in my life, someone saw me as just Claire. Not the daughter of Thomas Bennett, one of Chicago's most well-known real estate developers. Not the older sibling of my brother Andrew, who had joined my father's company right after business school and was already being groomed to take over the firm. Just Claire. The nurse who came in every night was exhausted and smelled faintly like an antiseptic. When Daniel finally asked me to dinner, 2 months later, I said yes before he finished the sentence. We dated for 3 years. Simple dates. Long walks by the lake. Take-out dinners on the floor of his apartment. He lived in a modest place in Lincoln Park with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled when the wind came off the water. It was the most comfortable place I had ever been. Daniel cooked. A lot. And he listened. Really listened. When I talked about my patients. When I talked about the little girl who finally finished chemotherapy. When I talked about the 6-year-old who brought me a crayon drawing that said, "Best nurse ever." Daniel would smile and say things like, "You're changing lives, Claire." And somehow, hearing it from him made me believe it. When he proposed, it happened the same way everything else in our relationship had happened. Quietly. We were sitting on the floor of his apartment eating Thai food. He pulled a small ring box from his pocket like it had been sitting there the whole evening. "Marry me," he said. Just like that. No speech. No dramatic moments. Just certainty. I said yes. I didn't tell my parents right away. In fact, I waited almost a month. Because I already knew exactly how that conversation would go. And unfortunately, I was right. When I finally told my mother during Sunday brunch at their house in Lake Forest, she nearly choked on her mimosa. "He works in education," she repeated. Yes. What does that even mean? It means he builds tools that help students learn. "So, he's a teacher?" she asked, clearly unimpressed. Not exactly. My mother sighed dramatically. "Claire," she said, "I always thought you would marry someone with ambition." I stared at her. "He has ambition," I said quietly. My father barely looked up from his phone. "Well," he muttered, "as long as you're happy." Which, in my family, was the equivalent of a formal blessing. Daniel never pushed me to explain my family dynamics. One night, about a year into our relationship, I asked him why. He thought about it for a moment. Then he took my hand and said, "I don't want your parents to like me for what I have. I want them to like me for who I am." At the time, I thought it was sweet. Idealistic. Maybe even a little naive. Because in my family, people weren't judged by who they were. They were judged by what they earned. And the number of zeros attached to it. The signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. Every holiday dinner followed the same script. My mother would beam proudly across the table at my brother. "Andrew, tell everyone about the Harrison project." Andrew would launch into a long explanation about zoning permits and development contracts. Everyone would lean in like he had just solved world hunger. Then my mother would turn to me. "And Claire, you're still working at the hospital?" She always said hospital the way someone else might say temporary job. "Yes," I'd reply. "I had a patient this week." "That's nice, dear." She'd already be looking at her phone. That was the first sign. The second sign hurt worse. But that story is what finally led to the retirement dinner. And the moment my husband stood up in a room full of people who thought he was nobody. The second sign came the following spring. The pediatric ward had been planning a small fundraiser and awareness event for months. It wasn't anything fancy, just a children's play performed by some of the patients who were healthy enough to participate, along with a few nurses and volunteers helping behind the scenes. But to us, it meant everything. Kids who had spent weeks hooked up to 4 machines were suddenly rehearsing lines, painting cardboard backdrops, and arguing over who got to wear the glitter crown in the final scene. I had helped one little boy named Mateo memorize his entire part. Every afternoon after my shift, we practiced in the playroom while he sat wrapped in a superhero blanket. Again, he'd say. And we'd start from the top. When opening night finally approached, I decided to invite my parents. I don't know why. Maybe some small part of me still hoped that one day they would look at what I did and see something worth being proud of. So I called my father. "Dad, the kids are putting on a play next Thursday," I told him. "It starts at 4. I'd really love for you to come." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the faint sound of typing. "I have real meetings during the day, Claire," he said finally. Real meetings. The words sat heavy in the air. It would mean a lot to me. I tried again. Another pause. Maybe next time. Next time. But there wasn't a next time. The play happened exactly once. Matteo delivered every line perfectly. And when the curtain closed, he ran off stage and hugged me so tightly I nearly cried. I clapped louder than anyone else in the room. But there were 2 empty chairs in the back row where my parents should have been. Later that evening, I saw photos on my mother's social media page. She and my father were attending one of Andrew's corporate networking dinners. My father had been to Andrew's office 11 times that year. I counted. The following Sunday at brunch, Andrew leaned toward me across the table. "You know Dad's disappointed, right?" he said casually. "About what?" "You had the same opportunities one did." I stared at him. We absolutely had not had the same opportunities. Andrew had always wanted to join the family business. I had wanted something else entirely. Something that mattered in a different way. But explaining that to my brother was like explaining color to someone who had only ever seen black and white. So I just smiled politely. And changed the subject. Daniel was sitting beside me that morning. He heard everything. That night, back at our apartment, he wrapped his arms around me and said quietly, "Your worth isn't determined by them." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But when you hear something your entire life, it burrows deep. And sometimes it takes years to dig it out again. By the time Daniel and I had been married for 4 years, the pattern had become almost predictable. Family gatherings meant subtle comments. Sideways glances. Questions that weren't really questions. So Andrew would say across the dinner table, swirling his wine glass. "Still working in education?" "Yes." "What exactly does that involve?" Daniel would smile politely. "Building tools for students and teachers." Andrew would nod slowly, like he was trying to understand something extremely complicated. "Interesting." And then the conversation would quickly return to stock portfolios or development deals. Daniel never pushed back. Not once. Later, when we were alone, I asked him why he never corrected them. "Because you asked me not to," he said simply. And he was right. I had asked him. More than once. "Please don't argue with them. Please don't make things worse. Please just let it go." Daniel always respected that. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I could see something in his expression. Not anger. Something quieter. Something patient. The retirement dinner invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't even a physical invitation. Just an email. A plain one. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the retirement of Thomas Bennett after 40 years of leadership in Chicago real estate development. Formal attire required. Location, the Grand Ballroom, Fairmont, Chicago." I stared at the message for a long time. 2 minutes later, my phone rang. My mother. "Claire," she said briskly. "I need to discuss the seating arrangements." "Okay. You and Daniel will be at table 16. I opened the digital floor plan attached to the email. Table 16 was in the far corner of the ballroom. Right beside the service doors leading to the kitchen. "Mom," I said carefully, "that's the last table in the room." "Well, we have important guests attending," she replied. "The Whitakers are flying in from New York. And the Langford group will be there as well. People your father actually works with." I swallowed. "Of course." "And Claire?" "Yes." "Try not to spend the entire evening talking about the hospital." Her voice lowered slightly. "These people have serious careers." The line went silent. She had already hung up. That evening I was sitting on the edge of our bed when Daniel walked into the room. He took one look at my face and sighed softly. "Back table?" he guessed. I nodded. "By the kitchen." He sat down beside me. "Do you want me to come?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I want you there," I said. "That's not what I asked." I hesitated. Because part of me did want to protect him from my family. From their quiet judgments. From the way they spoke about success like it was a currency people either had or didn't. But another part of me. The tired part. The part that had spent 33 years trying to prove something to people who never seemed satisfied. That part didn't want to face that ballroom alone. Yes, I said finally. I want you there. Daniel took my hand. I've stayed quiet for 4 years because you asked me to. His voice was calm. But there was something underneath it now. Something steady. But if they cross the line again, he continued softly, I'm not sure I can stay quiet anymore. I looked up at him. Daniel. He met my eyes. And for a brief moment, there was something in his expression I didn't fully understand. Not anger. Not exactly. More like certainty. Claire, he said gently, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. What? He hesitated. Then shook his head slightly. Not tonight. What do you mean? You'll see. I frowned. That's not very reassuring. He smiled faintly. Trust me. The night before the retirement dinner, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the future. About the life Daniel and I had built together. About the family we talked about starting someday. And about the lessons we would teach our children. Would I teach them to stay quiet when someone insulted them? To smile politely when someone made them feel small? To accept disrespect just to keep the peace? The answer came quickly. No. Absolutely not. So why was I still doing exactly that? The next morning, I checked my email. And found something I wasn't meant to see. My mother had accidentally forwarded a message to me that was clearly meant for Andrew. It was short. Just one sentence. Make sure Claire and her husband stay at the back tables. We don't want them making awkward small talk with the investors. I read it 3 times. Each time it hurt more. And suddenly something inside me shifted. Silence wasn't peace. Silence was permission. Permission for them to keep doing exactly what they'd always done. That night, Daniel and I dressed for the retirement dinner. He wore a simple dark suit. I wore a navy dress I had bought 3 years earlier on clearance. Before we left the apartment, Daniel picked up his briefcase from the hallway table. He opened it and removed a plain white envelope. Thick. Official-looking. He slid it carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. What's that? I asked. He paused. Then smiled slightly. Insurance. Insurance for what? He looked at me in a way he rarely did. Very steady. In case they go too far. I didn't ask what was inside the envelope. Part of me didn't want to know. And part of me still believed that maybe, just maybe, this night would be different. But when we stepped into the ballroom an hour later, I saw my mother standing near the stage greeting guests like royalty. I had a strange feeling that Daniel's insurance was going to matter a lot more than either of us expected. The grand ballroom at the Fairmont looked exactly the way my father liked things to look. Expensive. Impressive. And very carefully designed to remind everyone in the room who had paid for it. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. Round tables dressed in white linen stretched across the polished floor. A small orchestra played soft jazz near the stage while servers moved quietly between guests carrying trays of champagne. Nearly 200 people had gathered. Investors. Developers. City officials. Old friends. The kind of crowd that had helped build my father's reputation over the past 40 years. Daniel and I stepped through the entrance together. He wore a simple navy suit and a white shirt with no tie pin or flashy watch. I wore the dark blue dress I had bought years earlier and a pair of small pearl earrings my grandmother had given me before she passed away. We didn't look poor. But we didn't look like the rest of the room either. Near the entrance stood my mother. She wore an emerald green gown and a necklace that probably cost more than my car. She was greeting guests with the kind of warm smile she reserved only for people she considered important. When she saw us, that smile tightened slightly. "Claire," she said, leaning in for a quick air kiss. "You made it." "Of course," I replied. "It's Dad's retirement." Her eyes slid briefly toward Daniel. "And you brought him?" Daniel smiled politely. "I'm her husband," he said calmly. "That tends to happen." My mother let out a soft, tight laugh. "Yes, well, table 16 is in the back corner." "We know," I said. "Good." Her attention had already shifted to a couple walking through the door behind us. "Senator Whitaker," she exclaimed brightly. "So wonderful you could come." Daniel and I stepped aside as the senator and his wife were ushered inside with enthusiastic greetings. We walked slowly across the ballroom. I could feel people looking at us. Whispers moving quietly from table to table. "That's the older daughter. The nurse. The one who married the guy nobody knows." Daniel reached down and took my hand. "Table 16, he murmured. "Convenient." When we reached it, I almost laughed. The table wasn't just near the kitchen. It was practically inside it. Every time the service doors swung open, a wave of warm air and clattering dishes spilled into the room. Servers brushed past our chairs every few seconds. At least the view of the stage was mostly unobstructed. Small victories. We sat down. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying the room calmly. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I've had worse nights." "Do you want to leave?" I looked across the ballroom. Near the stage stood my father. Tall, confident, shaking hands with a group of investors. Next to him was my younger brother Andrew. Perfectly tailored tuxedo. Champagne glass in hand. Already laughing at something someone important had said. Andrew noticed us watching. He lifted his glass in a small mocking toast. Then turned back to his conversation. "No," I said finally. "I'm staying." Daniel nodded once. "All right." A few minutes later, a woman from the neighboring table turned around in her chair. She was probably in her early 50s. Sharp eyes. Expensive black suit. I recognized her immediately. Margaret Whitaker. One of the most powerful investors in Chicago real estate. She studied Daniel carefully. Her head tilted slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Have we met before?" Daniel shook his head politely. "I don't believe so." She frowned slightly. "Strange. You look familiar." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through something. Her expression changed almost immediately. Confusion. Then curiosity. Then something else entirely. But before she could say anything, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. The orchestra stopped playing. My father was walking toward the stage. Margaret glanced down at her phone again. Then back at Daniel. Her lips parted slightly. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned back toward the stage slowly. Just before my father reached the microphone, Andrew appeared beside our table. He carried a champagne flute and the same smug expression he'd worn all evening. "Well," he said, looking down at us. "You actually showed up." I forced a small smile. "Why wouldn't we?" Andrew shrugged. "These events aren't really your scene." His gaze shifted to Daniel. "Nice suit." "Thank you," Daniel replied calmly. "Outlet Mall?" Daniel smiled slightly. "No." "Right," Andrew said. "Just simple." He took a sip of champagne. "So Daniel," he continued casually. "Remind me again what you do." "I work in education." Andrew nodded slowly. "Education." He let the word hang in the air for a moment. "So like tutoring?" "No." "Test prep?" "No." Andrew laughed lightly. So basically like Claire then. You two must have a lot to talk about. My hands tightened in my lap. Daniel's expression didn't change. We do, he said calmly. Andrew smirked. Well, that's great. Not everyone needs ambition. The words landed like a small stone dropped into water. Ripples spreading quietly. Andrew, I said quietly. Don't you have somewhere else to be? He raised his hands innocently. Relax, Claire. I'm just making conversation. He glanced toward the stage. Dad's about to speak. Try not to look bored. There are photographers tonight. He turned and walked away, clearly satisfied with himself. Daniel watched him go. Then looked back at me. You all right? Not really. Do you want to leave now? I shook my head slowly. No. Daniel studied me for a moment. Then nodded. Okay. He reached over and squeezed my hand. They have no idea what they're doing. What do you mean? He glanced toward the stage where my father was adjusting the microphone. You'll see. The room grew quiet. My father tapped the microphone twice. Good evening, everyone. His voice carried easily through the ballroom. Confident. Controlled. Exactly the way he had spoken in hundreds of boardrooms over the years. Thank you all for being here tonight, he continued. 40 years ago, I started this company with nothing but a small loan and a very stubborn belief that Chicago real estate still had room to grow. Polite laughter rippled through the room. He smiled. But of course, I didn't do it alone. He gestured toward the front table. My wife, Linda. My partner in everything. My mother pressed her hand dramatically to her chest while cameras flashed. And my son Andrew, my father continued proudly. The future of Bennett Development. Andrew rose slightly from his seat as the room applauded. Photographers snapped pictures from every angle. My father beamed. Andrew has already proven himself an incredible leader, he continued. And I have no doubt the company will be in excellent hands. More applause. I sat quietly at table 16. Waiting. Because no matter how many times it had happened before, some small part of me still hoped this time might be different. My father cleared his throat. Of course, he said, family is more than business. My heart lifted slightly. I'm fortunate to have 2 children. His eyes moved across the ballroom. And landed on me. He smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the same one he used when addressing difficult clients. And Claire, he said. A pause. A long one. She's still figuring things out. Soft laughter drifted through the room. Not loud. Not cruel. Just uncomfortable enough to make it worse. But we love her anyway, my father added with a chuckle. My stomach twisted. Beside me, Daniel's hand tightened around mine. My father had already moved on. Now, he continued, let's talk about the future of the Bennett Foundation. But across from us, Margaret Whittaker was staring at Daniel again. Her eyes flicked from his face to her phone. Back to his face. Her expression had shifted completely now. Not confusion. Recognition. Finally, she leaned slightly toward him. Excuse me, she whispered. I'm sorry, but I have to ask. Daniel turned toward her politely. Yes? She held up her phone. The screen showed a photograph. A magazine cover. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Is this you? Margaret Whittaker held her phone just low enough that only Daniel and I could see the screen. But the glow from it was unmistakable. A magazine cover. A familiar one, apparently. Daniel glanced at the screen for only a second. Then he looked back up at her and smiled politely. I believe that's me, yes. Margaret blinked. Her eyes widened slightly. But before she could say another word, My father's voice carried across the ballroom again. Margaret, he said with a small chuckle from the stage. Care to share whatever has captured your attention so thoroughly? Margaret quickly lowered her phone. Just checking messages, Thomas, she said smoothly. My father laughed. Always working. That's why we keep you around. A ripple of polite laughter followed. Margaret didn't laugh. She slowly turned back in her seat. But over the next several minutes, I caught her glancing back at Daniel 3 more times. Each time with the exact same expression. Recognition. And disbelief. I leaned toward Daniel. What was that about? I whispered. Nothing important, he said quietly. That didn't look like nothing. He squeezed my hand gently. Let it go for now. For now. I didn't like the sound of that. Up on stage, my father was nearing the end of his speech. And with the foundation moving into its next phase, he said, I'm confident the company's legacy will continue long after I step away from day-to-day operations. Applause rolled through the ballroom. My father smiled. But before we finish, he said, I'd like to invite someone very important to join me on stage. He extended his hand toward the front table. My wife, Linda. My mother rose gracefully. The spotlight followed her as she made her way to the stage. She accepted the microphone with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades standing beside a powerful man. Thank you, darling, she said warmly. Then she turned to face the crowd. I'd like to say a few words about family. Something in my stomach tightened immediately. Because I knew that tone. I had heard it many times before. And it never ended well. 3 hours earlier, while Daniel and I were getting ready to leave our apartment, he had done something that seemed strange at the time. He had opened his briefcase and removed a plain white envelope. The same one I'd noticed earlier that evening. He slid it carefully into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. What's that? I asked. Insurance, he said. Insurance for what? He looked at me for a long moment before answering. For you, he said softly. In case they go too far. I hadn't asked any more questions. Part of me believed the night would pass the way these events always did. With a few uncomfortable comments. A few forced smiles. And an early drive home. But sitting there now, watching my mother hold the microphone with that carefully rehearsed smile, I had a sinking feeling that Daniel's insurance was about to matter. A lot. I want to talk about family tonight, my mother said. Her voice carried easily across the ballroom. Because behind every successful man is the support system that helped him get there. She glanced lovingly toward my father. Thomas has always worked incredibly hard. Polite nods from the audience. But of course, we didn't build this life alone. Her eyes shifted to Andrew. Our son Andrew has stepped up in remarkable ways. Andrew raised his glass slightly. More applause. He's already proving himself a capable leader for the next generation of the company. More smiles. More approving nods. Then my mother paused. Her gaze slowly moved across the ballroom. And landed on me. Right there at table 16. Near the kitchen doors. And then, she said, there's Claire. The room quieted. I felt my spine stiffen. Our eldest, my mother continued with a tight smile. She chose a different path. Soft laughter drifted through the crowd. She works at a hospital, my mother went on. Helping children, I believe. I felt heat creeping into my face. 3rd floor pediatrics, I whispered to myself. But of course, no one on stage could hear me. My mother tilted her head slightly. Or maybe it's oncology now. I can never remember. A few guests chuckled politely. Then she smiled wider. But you know what? She paused. At least she managed to find a husband. The room burst into laughter. Actual laughter. My chest tightened. And then she added the line that changed everything. Even if none of us are quite sure what he actually does. More laughter. Louder this time. Across the ballroom, several heads turned toward our table. I felt something inside me snap. Not my heart. My patience. Beside me, Daniel slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My father stepped back toward the microphone, still smiling. Now, Linda, he said lightly. Let's be kind. But he was clearly enjoying the moment. Claire has always had her own talents. He gestured vaguely in my direction. Some people are meant to lead, he continued. And others are meant to support. A few people nodded thoughtfully. Claire has always been more comfortable supporting. I felt my throat tighten. My father lifted his glass. We've tried to guide her, of course. More polite murmurs. We offered her opportunities at the company. I stared at him. That was not true. We even offered to fund further education. Another lie. But in the end, he said with a shrug, Claire chose her own path. A sympathetic murmur moved through the room. Poor Thomas. Such a disappointing daughter. And that's family, my father concluded with a chuckle. You love them anyway. He raised his glass again. To family. Around the ballroom, nearly 200 people raised their glasses in response. To family. And there I sat. At the table beside the kitchen. Being toasted as the family disappointment. Then I noticed something. Daniel's hand was no longer holding mine. His chair was empty. He was standing. Daniel, I whispered. What are you doing? He didn't answer. He simply adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the stage. Slowly. Calmly. Deliberately. At first, no one noticed. But then a few people near the center tables turned to look. Whispers started moving through the room. Who's that? What's he doing? My father saw him approaching. His smile faded. I'm sorry, my father said into the microphone. Can I help you? Daniel stepped onto the stage. The room went completely silent. He reached for the microphone. May I have a moment? He asked. My father frowned. And you are? Daniel looked out across the ballroom. At the investors. The developers. The people who had just laughed at my parents' jokes. Then he answered calmly. My name is Daniel Reed Bennett. The room held its breath. I'm Claire's husband, he continued. The one you apparently don't know anything about. A few nervous chuckles scattered through the crowd. My mother stepped forward quickly. This really isn't the time, she said sharply. Daniel didn't move. I think it's exactly the time. His voice wasn't loud. But every single word carried. For 4 years, he continued, I've sat quietly at your family dinners. I've listened to jokes about my career. I've watched you dismiss your daughter like she somehow doesn't measure up. He turned slightly, looking directly at me across the ballroom. And I stayed silent. My mother crossed her arms. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Thomas, call security. Daniel raised one hand calmly. No need. He turned back to the audience. I'm not here to cause a scene. A brief pause. I'm just here to introduce myself properly. Andrew pushed his way toward the stage. This is insane, he said loudly. Who does this guy think he is? Daniel smiled slightly. That's an excellent question. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My heart stopped. The envelope. But he didn't pull it out. Not yet. Instead, he looked out over the ballroom and said calmly, I believe some of you may have heard of my company. The entire room went still. Even my father looked uncertain now. What company? He asked slowly. Before Daniel could answer, Andrew grabbed the microphone. All right, That's enough, he said sharply. He turned toward me across the room. Claire, come get your husband before he embarrasses himself. The room laughed again. Andrew smirked. Let's be honest, he continued. This guy probably makes less than my assistant. A few guests chuckled. Maybe he's a tutor, Andrew added. Maybe he grades papers. He made exaggerated air quotes. Working in education. More laughter. Andrew handed the microphone back to Daniel. Now please, he said. Go sit down and let the adults finish celebrating. Daniel accepted the microphone. Then he smiled. Not angrily. Not smugly. Just calmly. You're right, he said. This isn't my night. A pause. But it became my night the moment your family publicly humiliated my wife in front of 200 people. Andrew rolled his eyes. So dramatic. Daniel ignored him. You're correct about one thing, he said. I do work in education. A long pause. But I don't tutor. He looked directly at my father. I build educational technology platforms. Margaret Whittaker suddenly stood up from her chair. Her voice cut through the silence. Oh my God. All eyes turned toward her. I knew I recognized him. Andrew frowned. What are you talking about? Margaret looked from Daniel to my father. Her face had gone pale. Thomas, she said slowly. Your daughter didn't marry a nobody. The entire ballroom seemed to lean forward. Margaret took a breath. Then she said the words that changed everything. He's the founder of Bright Path Learning. The name Bright Path Learning moved through the ballroom like a shockwave. At first, there was confusion. A few people exchanged glances. Several guests reached for their phones. Then recognition began spreading table by table. Eyes widened. Brows lifted. Whispers turned into quiet gasps. I watched it happen in real time. A man near the front typed something quickly into his phone and turned the screen toward the woman beside him. Her hand flew to her mouth. At another table, someone muttered. Wait, that Bright Path? Margaret Whittaker stepped closer to the stage, her voice rising slightly. Yes, she said. That Bright Path. She looked directly at my father. The educational technology company that was valued at $180 million this year. The murmurs grew louder. Didn't they just? Featured in Forbes. Global School Platform. Andrew's confident expression began to crumble. That's not possible, he said quickly. Daniel didn't raise his voice. But every word landed clearly. I assure you, he said calmly. It's very possible. My mother clutched my father's arm. Thomas, she whispered urgently. Did you know about this? My father looked completely stunned. No, he said quietly. His gaze moved slowly across the ballroom. Then back to Daniel. You never told us. Daniel's expression remained calm. You never asked. The words settled over the room like falling snow. In 4 years, Daniel continued, not once did you ask me a real question about my work. Not about my company. Not about my life. Not about anything. He took a slow step forward. The spotlight followed him automatically. You decided who I was the moment you heard the word education. Silence filled the ballroom. You assumed I was unimportant because I didn't brag, he continued. Because I didn't flash money. Because I sat quietly at your dinner table and treated people with respect. Margaret Whittaker nodded slowly. I knew I'd seen him before, she said to the room. She lifted her phone again. 3 months ago, she continued, he was on the cover of Tech Innovators magazine. Several guests leaned closer to see the image on her screen. There was Daniel. Same calm expression. Headline across the cover. The man transforming global education technology. Andrew's mouth opened slightly. Then closed again. Daniel continued speaking. Last year BrightPath expanded into 22 countries. We built a learning platform now used by over 4 million students. I've had meetings with state education boards across the country, senators, policymakers, and school districts that needed tools they couldn't afford before. He paused, then looked directly at Andrew. So no, he said quietly. I don't make less than your assistant. Andrew's face had gone completely pale. But even if I did, Daniel added calmly, that still wouldn't justify how you've treated my wife. The silence that followed felt enormous. 200 people listening. Watching. Realizing. Margaret turned slowly toward my father again. Thomas, she said. I've been trying to get a meeting with BrightPath for 6 months. My father blinked. What? She held up her phone again. We've been looking to invest in educational technology expansion. She gestured toward Daniel. And the opportunity was sitting at your dinner table this entire time. My father's composure finally cracked. We didn't. You didn't bother to find out, Daniel finished calmly. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. And finally removed the envelope. The same white envelope I had seen earlier that evening. The same one he called insurance. The room watched closely as he opened it. Inside was a thick document. Official. Important. Daniel held it up slightly. This, he said, is a contract. He paused long enough for the room to settle again. A $5 million grant. The number rippled through the ballroom instantly. 5 million? Did he say? Grant? Daniel nodded. Yes. It's part of BrightPath's new initiative to fund STEM programs in underfunded schools across Illinois. The murmurs grew louder. And the very first school selected, Daniel continued, is Lakeview Children's Hospital Education Wing. My heart stopped. That was my hospital. That was my floor. Daniel turned toward me. His voice softened slightly. The pediatric unit where Claire works. My vision blurred instantly. I hadn't expected that. Not even remotely. Daniel lifted the contract so the guests closest to the stage could see the logo at the top. BrightPath Learning. Signature at the bottom. His signature. And highlighted near the center of the document. Lakeview Children's Hospital Pediatric Learning Program. This isn't charity, Daniel said calmly. It's an investment. He looked across the ballroom again. At that hospital, he continued, Claire works with children facing the hardest moments of their lives. She stays after shifts to help kids keep up with schoolwork. She buys learning materials with her own money. She helps children who are scared, exhausted, and fighting battles most adults couldn't imagine. His voice tightened slightly. And you call her a disappointment? The silence in the ballroom became almost unbearable. Daniel shook his head slowly. Claire is the reason BrightPath exists. I blinked through tears. What? I whispered from my seat. Daniel looked at me again. When we first met, he continued softly, she told me about a little girl who had missed almost a full year of school during chemotherapy. He turned back to the room. She said the hardest part wasn't the hospital treatments. It was watching that child fall behind in class. That conversation stayed with me. He tapped the document gently. So I built a platform that helps children keep learning, even from hospital beds. His eyes returned to mine. That's why BrightPath was created. The room was completely silent now. No whispers. No laughter. Just stunned attention. Daniel stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted automatically as he walked toward me. I stood up, my legs shaking. When he reached me, he took both of my hands. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner, he said quietly. I kept hoping they would see you. His voice softened even more. The way I see you. I couldn't speak. Tears were running freely down my face. "I've never been prouder to be your husband," he said. Behind us, my mother's voice trembled. "Claire," she said. "Why didn't you tell us?" I slowly turned around to face them. My father looked shaken. Andrew had stepped back into the crowd, trying very hard to disappear. And in that moment, standing in the center of that enormous ballroom, something inside me finally shifted. Not anger. Something clearer. Something stronger. I looked directly at my parents and asked the question that had been waiting 33 years to be said. Would it have mattered? Would it have mattered? My voice didn't shake when I said it. That surprised me more than anything. For most of my life, conversations with my parents had left me feeling like a nervous teenager again, careful with every word, hoping not to say something that would trigger another lecture about ambition or wasted potential. But standing there in that ballroom, with 200 people watching, something inside me had finally settled. My mother opened her mouth first. "Of course it would have mattered," she said quickly. But the words didn't land the way she wanted them to. Not after everything that had just happened. I tilted my head slightly. "Really?" She hesitated. "You've been dismissing me for 33 years, I continued. "You've made jokes about my career at every family dinner. You just stood on a stage and told 200 people that you don't even know what my husband does for a living." My father shifted uncomfortably. "That was a misunderstanding." "No," I said calmly. "It wasn't." The room was still completely silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every guest was watching. "If Daniel had actually been broke," I continued, "if he had been a tutor making minimum wage, would that have made your behavior okay?" My mother blinked. My father said nothing. That was answer enough. Daniel's hand rested gently at the small of my back. He wasn't speaking for me. He was just standing there, supporting me. This was my moment. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to take it. My father cleared his throat. His business instincts were already kicking in. "Daniel," he said, stepping forward slightly. "This has clearly been a misunderstanding." Daniel didn't respond. "I had no idea about your company," my father continued quickly. "But perhaps we should talk. There may be opportunities for collaboration between BrightPath and some of our development partners." The words sounded so familiar. So predictable. I almost laughed. But Daniel answered before I could. "No." The word landed heavily. Clear. Final. My father blinked. "I'm sorry?" "No," Daniel repeated calmly. "But this could be mutually beneficial," my father insisted. "Our company has connections?" "The opportunity was 4 years ago," Daniel interrupted gently. The room went even quieter. "4 years ago," he continued, "when you could have treated your daughter with respect." My father's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You seated us beside the kitchen tonight. That was simply a seating arrangement issue. You forwarded an email asking your son to keep us away from investors." My mother's face drained of color. "How did you?" "Claire showed me," Daniel said. The truth hung in the air between them. My parents looked at each other. For the first time in my entire life, they had no explanation. No clever spin. No way to reframe what had happened. Just the raw reality of their own behavior. My mother clasped her hands together. "Claire," she said softly, "we can start over." Her voice sounded almost desperate now. "Family is family." I took a slow breath. "Is it?" I stepped forward slightly. Because this wasn't just about Daniel. This was about every moment I had spent trying to earn approval that never came. "You've spent my entire life making me feel like I didn't belong here," I said. "Like I was an embarrassment. Like I was a charity case you had to tolerate." My father looked around the ballroom nervously. perhaps hoping the crowd would disappear. They didn't. You said you didn't know what my husband does for a living, I continued. But the truth is, you never cared enough to ask. Behind them, Andrew tried to speak up from the edge of the crowd. Well, how were we supposed to know? You weren't supposed to know, Daniel said calmly. Andrew froze. You were supposed to be decent. The words landed harder than anything else that had been said that night. Daniel looked around the ballroom briefly. That shouldn't require a Forbes article. A few guests shifted awkwardly. Margaret Whittaker nodded slowly. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Perhaps, he said tightly, we should continue this conversation privately. I shook my head. No. My voice was steady. I'm done doing things privately. I walked toward the stage. Daniel followed beside me. When I reached the microphone, I looked out at the room. At the investors. The politicians. The business partners my parents had spent decades trying to impress. For years, I had believed I needed their approval too. Now I realized something. I didn't. My name is Claire Bennett, I said into the microphone. A small ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. The disappointing daughter. A few people looked embarrassed now. Good. For 33 years, I continued, I tried to earn my parents' approval. I chose a career I love. They called it a waste. I married a man I love. They called him a nobody. I showed up to every family dinner, every birthday, every holiday. And they seated me by the kitchen. My voice remained calm. Stronger than I expected. Tonight you discovered that my husband is successful. I gestured toward Daniel. Wealthy. Influential. I paused. But here's the important part. I looked directly at my parents. That shouldn't change anything. The ballroom was completely silent again. The way you treated me was wrong before you knew about Daniel's company. And the fact that you only care now. I shook my head slowly. Now that there's money involved. That proves exactly what I've always suspected. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Claire, please. I'm not finished. She fell silent. I have a career that matters, I said. A husband who loves me. A life I built without your approval. I took a breath. And from now on, respect is the minimum requirement. Not optional. Not conditional. Just basic respect. I looked at my mother. Then my father. Then Andrew. If you can give me that, we can try again. If you can't. I reached for Daniel's hand. Then this is goodbye. I stepped away from the microphone. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. Together, we walked toward the exit. 200 people watched us leave the ballroom. No one said a word. We didn't speak until we were in the car. Daniel started the engine and pulled away from the hotel. The city lights of downtown Chicago blurred past the windows. I stared out at them quietly. Finally he glanced over. Are you okay? I wiped my cheeks. I don't know. How do you feel? I thought about it for a moment. Then I said something I had never said before. Like I've been carrying something heavy for years. And I finally set it down. Daniel smiled softly. That's not emptiness. That's relief. My phone buzzed in my purse. Again. And again. And again. I finally pulled it out. 22 missed calls. 12 from my mother. 7 from my father. 3 from Andrew. Voicemails stacked on top of each other. I played the first one. My mother's voice filled the car. Claire, honey, please come back. This was all a misunderstanding. We need to talk. Misunderstanding. Like she had accidentally mispronounced my name. I deleted it. The second voicemail was my father. Daniel seems like a very impressive young man. Perhaps we could have dinner and discuss some opportunities. Delete. Andrew had sent a text message. I read it out loud. I can't believe you hid this from us. That's incredibly selfish. Daniel chuckled quietly. Selfish. She still thinks she's the victim, I said. Of course she does. I turned my phone off and leaned back in the seat. The silence between us felt peaceful. After a few minutes, I asked quietly, do you regret staying quiet for so long? Daniel thought about it. Sometimes. He reached over and took my hand. But I did it for you. I nodded. I know. I looked out at the road ahead. Dark. Uncertain. Tonight, I said slowly, I finally said what I needed to say. Daniel smiled. Are you glad? I considered the question carefully. Then answered honestly. Not yet. I looked back at the skyline fading behind us. But I think, someday I will be. The fallout began the next morning. At exactly 7:42 a.m. Daniel and I were standing in our kitchen making coffee when his phone rang. He glanced down at the screen and raised his eyebrows slightly. Margaret Whittaker, he said. I leaned against the counter while he answered. Good morning, Margaret. Her voice was loud enough that I could hear it from where I stood. Daniel, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do, she said firmly. I had no idea Thomas Bennett's family would behave like that last night. That was, honestly, one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever witnessed. Daniel smiled faintly. It wasn't your fault. Well, it certainly opened my eyes, she replied. There was a short pause. Also, she continued, I've been trying to arrange a meeting with Brightpath for 6 months. Daniel laughed softly. I'm aware. I kept going through Thomas, she said. I assumed he had a connection. Daniel glanced at me. Turns out, Margaret said dryly, the connection was sitting at table 16. I couldn't help smiling. Anyway, she continued, when you're ready, I'd love to discuss a partnership. Our firm is still very interested in Brightpath's expansion plans. We can set something up next week, Daniel said. After the call ended, he set his phone on the counter. Well, he said lightly. That was quick. I poured coffee into 2 mugs. What did she want? She's withdrawing her firm's investment from my father's development project. I looked up. Because of last night? Because of judgment, Daniel said calmly. Apparently humiliating the founder of a major education company at your own retirement party raises concerns. I thought about that for a moment. Strangely, I didn't feel satisfied. But I didn't feel guilty either. Mostly. I felt peaceful. Over the next week, the story spread through Chicago's business community faster than I could have imagined. Apparently 200 witnesses in one ballroom was more than enough. By Monday morning, everyone seemed to know. Bennett retirement dinner disaster. Real estate developer publicly insults $180 million tech founder. Even though no one had filmed the moment itself, the story still traveled quickly through word of mouth. In business circles, reputation was everything. And my father's had taken a serious hit. 2 major deals he had been negotiating quietly fell apart within days. Investors suddenly had concerns. One development partner cited misalignment of values. Another mentioned leadership judgment. My father's company wasn't collapsing. But the damage was real. Meanwhile, Andrew was quietly removed from the Harrison development project he had been celebrating a week earlier. Too much awkwardness, someone told Daniel privately. Andrew blamed me, of course. I received a series of angry messages from him over the next few days. Apparently I had ruined everything. I didn't reply. The most surprising call came 3 days after the retirement dinner. It wasn't from my parents. It was from my uncle. Uncle Robert was my father's older brother. 30 years ago, he had left the family real estate business to become a high school principal. My father had called that decision a waste of potential for most of my childhood. But Uncle Robert had always been kind to me. "Claire," he said warmly when I answered. "I heard about the dinner." I sighed. "I figured you would. Word travels fast." There was a pause. Then he chuckled softly. "I wish I could have seen your father's face." I laughed despite myself. "You and me both." "I've been telling him for years he was wrong about you," Uncle Robert continued. The words caught me off guard. "You have?" "Every holiday dinner," he said. "Every time he made some comment about your little hospital job." Something loosened in my chest. "Why didn't you ever say anything to me?" "Because I didn't want to interfere," he said gently. "And honestly, I wasn't sure you'd believe me. I thought about all those family dinners. All those moments where Uncle Robert sat quietly in the corner while my father dominated the room." Then he added something else. "What Daniel did, standing up for you like that." His voice softened slightly. "That took courage." I smiled. "It did. And what you did," he continued, "standing up to your parents after that. That took even more." Suddenly I realized I was crying. Not sad tears. Something lighter. Something healing. "I'm proud of you, kid," Uncle Robert said. "I always have been." "Thank you," I whispered. "And Claire?" "Yes." "Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up." His voice cracked slightly. "Daniel showed up for you. And now you're showing up for yourself." That evening, Daniel found me sitting on the couch still thinking about the conversation. "Good tears?" he asked. "Good tears." He sat beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Not everyone in your family gave up on you," he said. "I know." I leaned into him. "And I'm finally starting to see that." "Before I continue, quick question for you. If you were in my position, would you forgive your parents? Or would you make them earn that second chance? Tell me in the comments. And if you've made it this far into the story, make sure you subscribe to Women Reddit Stories for more stories like this. Because what happened next, 3 weeks later, was something I didn't expect either. 3 weeks after the retirement dinner, I agreed to meet my parents. But only on my terms. Neutral ground. A public place. A small cafe downtown. When I arrived, they were already sitting at a table near the window. They looked different. Smaller somehow. My father wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. Just a simple polo shirt. My mother's jewelry was noticeably absent. I sat down across from them. Daniel had offered to come with me. But I told him this was something I needed to do myself. "Thank you for meeting us," my father said stiffly. "Thank you for respecting the location," I replied. An awkward silence followed. My mother spoke first. "Claire, we want to start over." I nodded slowly. Starting over requires acknowledging what went wrong. They exchanged a quick glance. My father sighed. "We were hard on you," he admitted. "Because we wanted more for you." I shook my head gently. "No." He looked confused. "You were hard on me because I didn't fit your definition of success." "That's not the same thing." My mother's eyes filled with tears again. "We just wanted you to have security." "I have security. Just not the kind you respect." Another silence settled over the table. Finally my father asked quietly, "What do you want from us?" "Change." "What kind of change?" "Basic respect," I said. "Real questions. Actual interest in my life. Not just when it benefits you." I looked at both of them carefully. "I'm willing to give you a chance. But it's conditional. Respect first. Always." My mother nodded quickly. We can do that. My father cleared his throat. Yes, he said. We can. I studied them for a moment. Then I nodded once. We'll see. That night, Daniel and I sat on our apartment balcony. The Chicago skyline glittered in the distance. A bottle of wine sat on the small table between us. Half empty. How do you feel? Daniel asked. I thought about the past few weeks. About the ballroom. The speeches. The moment everything finally changed. Like I'm starting over, I said. With them, he asked. I shook my head. With myself. He smiled. Any regrets? I leaned against his shoulder. Only that I waited so long. After a moment, I said something else. You know what's strange? What? For years I thought I needed their approval to feel like I mattered. I looked out over the city lights. And now I realize something. What? I always mattered. I just needed to believe it. Daniel kissed the top of my head. You change children's lives every day. That matters. I know. And for the first time in my life, I actually believed it. We sat there quietly for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Cars. Laughter. Life moving forward. Finally Daniel asked. So what happens next? I smiled. We keep building our life. The hospital program. Bright path. Everything. He nodded. Together? I took his hand. Always. I thought about my students. About the children in the hospital. About the STEM program that would soon help them keep learning even while they fought for their health. And I thought about my parents. Maybe they would change. Maybe they wouldn't. But either way, I wasn't waiting for their validation anymore. Because the people who truly love you don't make you prove your worth. They celebrate it. Daniel had taught me that. And now, I was finally teaching it to myself. I turned to him and smiled. A real smile. You know what? What? I think I'm going to be okay. And for the first time in 33 years. I meant it. That's my story. If this resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen by the people who were supposed to see you the most, remember that your worth isn't something anyone else gets to decide. Thanks for watching Women Reddit Stories. And I'll see you in the next story.